So we're going to do about hedgehogs today. I have worked for Warwickshire Wildlife Trust for about 5 years, and for 4 of those I've been a hedgehog officer. So hopefully I'll vaguely know what I'm talking about, and you can savour up your questions to ask me. My details are on the bottom here, best contactable by email at the moment since I'm mostly working from home. So that's just at the bottom there. We do have some hashtags for social media if you want to post about this webinar or about the project that we're running. We're on Instagram, YouTube, Facebook, and Twitter, and these are our Warwickshire Wildlife Trust accounts here. A big note is that we are able to do this tonight because of the National Lottery Heritage Fund, who are actually fully funding our Wilder Future for Warwickshire project, which is great because it means that we get to run webinars like this for free. So big shout out to them. Many thanks for funding work like this. So just a bit of an introduction to Warwickshire Wildlife Trust, for those of you that don't know much about it. This project that we're running, and the reason that we're doing this webinar as part of it, it forms part of our 50-year celebrations. So that's actually really exciting for us at the moment, that we've hit this big milestone. We started off really small with just 8 people back in 1956, and we were together with other areas, so for instance Staffordshire and Worcestershire, and we formed the West Midlands Trust for Nature Conservation. These kind of separated over time, and we became solo Warwickshire in 1970, where we formed WARNAC, the Warwickshire Nature Conservation Trust. And this was quite a good acronym because it made warn and act, which is exactly what the people that formed it wanted to do. They wanted to be able to raise awareness and take action. So there was quite an emphasis on campaigning. So you can see Bishop's Hill Nature Reserve campaigns just here. And there was also some more expansion as more members joined. We only had 200 at the time, and we gained more land as well because we only had 2 reserves at that time. So we gained our headquarters at Brandon Marsh Nature Reserve. You can actually see David Attenborough on the top right there, opening part of it for us. That was a big milestone. We've now got a secondary HQ over in Solihull, because we cover the Vice County of Warwickshire, so we cover Warwickshire, Coventry and Solihull, so it gives us a presence across the whole of the Vice County. We're now the leading local conservation charity. We have around 66 nature reserves that you can see on the map on the right there. Over 500 volunteers giving up their time to help us manage our nature reserves, and to tell people and raise awareness about the work that we do, and over 24,000 members, which has actually increased during the pandemic, as people have learned to appreciate their local green space, which is fantastic, and they're really getting out there and enjoying being in it. So we've obviously come a long way. Ultimately, our goal is to bring people closer to nature, and to create a land that's rich in wildlife, and we want that to be on a landscape scale, and that's what we want to do, which fits in actually really well with this project, or rather that our project fits in really well with this vision, because it's all about engaging people in conservation. So the project that this webinar forms part of is called A Wilder Future for Warwickshire, as I mentioned, funded by the Lottery Heritage Fund. Just going to check to make sure that everyone's joined. There's no more in the waiting room. That's fine. Okay, yeah, we form part of A Wilder Future for Warwickshire, and that is the title of our new project, which is really exciting. It's just started up and running again after the pandemic has hit. So we started it back in January, and we've now restarted it after a period of a 5-month pause. So you're at the very beginning if you do want to sign up, which is great because you get to take advantage of all of the stuff that we're going to put on offer. So the idea is we've recognised that young people are going to be the ones that are dealing with the environmental consequences of the current generation. So what we want to do is be able to train young people in conservation, to engage them in it, to teach them what they want to learn about it, and then to teach them how to raise awareness about it so they can shout about the conservation issues of the current time. So this is going to be through a mixture of marketing and communication training as well. So that might involve things like debating, public speaking, storytelling. And ultimately, we want to learn from the past to make changes in the future. So this will involve in the future putting our young adult volunteers in touch with our long-standing members and volunteers so that they can actually share knowledge and have a knowledge exchange, as it were, which will be brilliant. The project at the moment is based around the interests of the current volunteers and of those as more people sign up. So you're going to learn what you want to learn, and it's also going to be based around when you're available. So for instance, tonight lots of people are free in weekday evenings, so we're holding the webinar now. If you haven't already joined, you can sign up to the programme and register your interest at the webpage at the bottom there that tells you a bit more about it as well. At the moment it's going to be run digitally, but that is likely to change in the future as things hopefully change with the pandemic situation. So here is just a very short video from Hannah Stitfall and Sophie Pavel, which is going to tell you about why you should join our amazing programme.
Hi, I'm Hannah.
And I'm Sophie, and we're here to encourage you to join in with the Young Adult Ambassador Programme for Warwickshire Wildlife Trust.
And it couldn't be easier, and it's so much fun. I mean, getting out into nature is, well, it is fun, but it's also really important, isn't it? Yeah. And our doorstep wildlife here in the UK is spectacular.
Warwickshire Wildlife Trust are an amazing charity, and they'll support you, they'll give you leaflets, idea skills, they'll give you help, and it's an amazing thing to do this year.
So make sure you get involved.
Okay, brilliant. Some of you may well recognise them from on TV and having been blogging. They're real ambassadors for the environment.
Hi, I'm Hannah.
Oh, okay, I don't think you want to watch it again. So now we are going to move on to hedgehogs. Hedgehogs are, well, they're an amazing animal. They are Britain's favourite mammal, voted many, many times. And they are our only spiky mammal that we have here in Britain. So today we're going to talk a bit about their ecology, then reasons for their unfortunate decline in Britain, but then move on to ways that we can help them and survey for them, and the things that we can do habitat-wise for them. So that's the rough programme of what we're going to be doing. So hedgehogs are part of an order that's little known, that is called Ulipotyphla. It's quite hard to say, but they're sort of on their own really in that with not many other animals. In England, they're most closely related, or no, not massively closely related, with moles and shrews, which you can probably understand in the sense that all of these animals have got quite long noses to smell out their invertebrate prey that are quite close to the ground. Elsewhere in the world, they are related to a wide variety of other fascinating animals, including desmans, which are diving insectivores. We've got a whole world, if you want to lose yourself in Google, on shrew-like moles and mole-like shrews, which do exist. I would recommend you look them up. And also moon rats, which are also known as hairy hedgehogs. Hedgehogs themselves have been around for a long, long time. Their ancestors date back to about 55 million years ago. So we're talking an Eocene, which is an epoch in time immediately following the Cretaceous, when the dinosaurs famously phased out, and we started to get the appearance of more and more grasses. But hedgehogs as we know them, as recognisable, probably date back to about 15 million years ago. Interestingly enough, the fossilised remains of an animal named Spinalestes xenarthrosus was found a few years ago in Spain. And this is described as a hedgehog-like spiny mammal. And that actually dates back to 125 million years ago. So we're starting to rethink where hedgehogs might actually fit into our evolutionary tree. And it might be a lot longer ago than we all thought. So they've been around for a really, really long time. So across the world, we actually have arguably 17 different species of hedgehog, which you might not know because not many of them are familiar to us. They're split across 5 different groups or genera, of which some examples are provided here. So at the top left here, we've got the northern white-breasted hedgehog. This lives in Eastern Europe. It looks quite similar to our hedgehog, apart from the white banding that you should be able to see there. And it is in fact part of the same group as our hedgehogs, and does in some places hybridize with our hedgehog that we have in England, quite interestingly. On the right top there, we've got the four-toed hedgehog, which might look familiar. You may well have seen videos posted on Facebook and social media of people with pet hedgehogs, and these have actually been crossbred from these four-toed hedgehogs. Aptly named because they have 4 toes instead of 5 like most other hedgehogs. They're quite small, and their wild counterparts are from Central Africa. And I was actually lucky enough to see one when I was in Kenya last year, which was amazing, just walking past my hotel room, which was lovely. We do have also down the bottom, on the bottom left, the Dowrian hedgehog, which I think is a fantastic looking hedgehog, really beefy to help it cope with the cold climates in which it lives in Mongolia and China. We have then 2 other groups, but they have similar looking hedgehogs in them, largely because of their adaptations to their environments. So we've got the long-eared hedgehog in the middle there and Brandt's hedgehog at the bottom right. These are both adapted to live in desert-style environments. So, for instance, they have quite long ears to help them hear their invertebrate prey amongst the sand, and they have quite long legs to help them travel long distances in search of food and water. There are a wide variety of other animals in the world that have spikes. So we've got the tenrecs, porcupines and echidnas that you may well have heard of or seen pictures of. They're not actually related to hedgehogs. So they're an example of what we would call convergent evolution, where lots of animals have developed a similar adaptation to cope with their environment, but independently of each other. It seems that spines are a great defense and work really well against different predators in different countries. So that's just to give you a bit of a flavour. In the UK, however, we only have 1 species of wild hedgehog, arguably the most attractive and best of them all. Hopefully familiar to you. You can see a picture on the top left-hand side there. So we have the West European hedgehog, mostly because it lives in Western Europe. Erinaceus europaeus for those who like their Latin. So you can actually see from the bottom left map there that the range actually is quite extensive and does go further into the east. Hence you can imagine how it hybridizes with the white-breasted hedgehog in the east of Europe. We do have colour variations, so you can see on the top right there a blonde hedgehog. We also get albinos and white hedgehogs with black eyes and black noses. The blonde hedgehogs are actually quite common on some of our islands. So for instance, the Isle of Alderney has about 1/4 of its population of blonde hedgehogs. The blonde is caused by what's called leucism. It's caused by recessive genes. So presumably the founding populations that went onto those islands had those recessive genes, and they've become more prevalent in the population as they've bred. And actually scientific studies underway at the moment to see how many there are on the islands at the moment, and whether they're becoming more prevalent in the population. But most of the time you will see our more browny coloured looking hedgehog around. There is actually, I think there's 2 blonde hedgehogs knocking around Solihull that we frequently get pictures of. So if you're in that area, you may well see them. The bottom right shows the distribution of hedgehogs in Britain. So in Europe, the IUCN doesn't class hedgehogs as endangered or vulnerable or anything. They're of least concern because they've got quite a wide range and they're thought to be quite common. But here in Britain, we do think of them as being a bit more vulnerable, which we'll talk about later. But you can see from the map that they do have an extensive range. So they cover most habitats. They generally don't tend to live in places where they can't make hibernation nests. So generally places that don't have leaves for them to make their winter nests in. So this might be, for instance, really mountainous regions, or really urban regions with lots of roads and grey infrastructure, or sometimes pine forests. Although animals love to buck the trend, and you do find hedgehogs making nests out of litter or pine needles or whatever else, or even using the odd rabbit burrow. So it's not to say never, they're just less common. So hedgehogs are largely insectivorous. They mostly eat invertebrates, ones that are quite easy for them to get to on the ground that aren't particularly active. They do sometimes eat other things, so they might eat eggs or chicks or carrion, but mostly they rely on their invertebrate prey. So earthworms are their staple, because these are around for all season that they're awake. So they will try and get earthworms. Of course, when it's very dry, these earthworms burrow quite deep into the ground and can be quite hard to get. So particularly in dry space, they will turn to other foods. One of their favourite other foods is beetles. They really like to eat beetles. And this is quite good for us in the sense that it makes their droppings quite identifiable. So the picture on the top right is actually a very fresh hedgehog dropping. It's quite wet, but actually I have one here that's more recognisable. As you do, I just have this in my house. I'm hoping that you can see this. Put it up a little bit. Anyway, that is a hedgehog dropping. It's quite characteristic because it is full of the crunched up remains of beetles. And this means it often glistens in the light. So you can quite easily see a hedgehog dropping. It doesn't look like most other things. They don't tend to make piles of them. They're usually just one or two as they've walked along. And hedgehogs are non-territorial, so they will generally tend to leave them wherever they decide they want to go. They won't pile them on a mound or somewhere obvious or anywhere like that. So that makes them a bit difficult for us to survey for them. We can't just go out and look for them because they could be anywhere. But if you happen to opportunistically come across one, you can be fairly confident that there are hedgehogs roaming around that area, which is great. Sorry. In terms of people feeding hedgehogs, lots of people like to do this. This time of year is actually a really good time. Sorry about that. So this time of year, we've got lots of youngsters that are trying to fatten up for the winter. So lots of people like to put food down. If you do want to put food down, you can buy hedgehog food that is made for hedgehogs, but also you can use a meaty cat or dog food, not fish-based, and maybe put it out with a saucer of water is quite helpful. But do avoid bread and milk. Hedgehogs are partially lactose intolerant, so we try and avoid that because they like it, but it can make them quite poorly. Hedgehogs generally live about 2 years in the wild, so this often surprises people because it doesn't seem very long. Once you've got a hedgehog in the wild that's about 5 years, it's getting quite old. It's thought to be most of the time because they eat so many earthworms, they take a lot of grit into their mouths when they do this, and this really grinds down their teeth. So in the end, their teeth just aren't up to the job. So they kind of live very fast and die relatively young for their size. Around about now is quite a good time to see hedgehogs. They're quite active at the moment. Everyone's trying to fatten up for the winter, basically. They're trying to pile on the pounds, so they're busy foraging for food, and it's still relatively mild at the moment. It hasn't gone that cold. So you'll get the mums, some of which have had a second litter very recently, so they'll need to build up their body condition in time for the winter. You'll have the youngsters, especially if there has been a second litter, which I know from doing surveys that there has in some places, so they'll really need to fatten up for winter. And the males are generally in better condition at this time of year. They haven't had to raise any young, so they'll be looking to hibernate quite soon. They generally tend to hibernate, we're talking about November-ish, depending on the temperatures and conditions. And this is basically in response to a lack of food and a need to conserve energy throughout the winter season. So you're much less likely to see hedgehogs around in the winter than you are in the autumn and about now. Hibernation is a really cool biological state. We try and simplify it sometimes and say it's a bit like sleep. It's not really like sleep. It's its whole own other realm. If you are interested in the science of it, there's a really good section in Pat Morris's book, which is this one. There's a kind of a hedgehog Bible. I will send details out of the resources if you're signed up, so don't worry too much about that, but I would really recommend this book. Fascinating insight into hibernation in here as an introduction as well. And there's lots of scientific papers on it, but essentially the hedgehog tries to conserve energy, so it shuts down or slows down a lot of its bodily processes. So its heartbeat really slows, its breathing really slows. They actually have often periods of apnea during their sleep where they're not breathing for a couple of minutes at a time. And this is all happening so that they can make it through the winter. They don't want to be too warm. Lots of people think if they find a hedgehog, oh, you know, I'll put it inside so that it doesn't get too cold. But actually this just means that they're wasting energy and they're probably going to wake up. So they don't want to be too cold either. They don't want to freeze. They don't want it to be below freezing if they can help it. So when they hibernate, they sort of want ideal conditions of around about 4 degrees C. Come the spring, they all start to wake up. So you can imagine if you'd been asleep for almost half the year, you would be exceptionally hungry. They've lost about a third of their body weight or up to that much. So it's, again, a really good time to survey and look for them because they're really active. They're finding loads and loads of food as much as they can, but they're also looking for love. So May is the mating season for hedgehogs. It's when they're at their most vocal and you're most likely to hear them. And hopefully you will see the fruits of all of that mating come the summer when we get baby hedgehogs born. And these baby hedgehogs are called hoglets, which is a pretty cute name, I always think. There's a gestation period in the womb for about 4 weeks, and then the babies are born in a special nest with the mum where they stay for 3 to 4 weeks, and then they start venturing out with her on short little foraging expeditions to learn what they can eat. And then after anywhere between 6 and 8 weeks, they are actually fully independent and they go off and disperse and live their own lives. So it is very fast in the life of a hedgehog. I'm just going to try and share you this video, which is of hedgehog courtship. Okay, I'm hoping that most of you saw that. I'm just going to check again to see that no one's waiting to come in. We're all good. Okay. Okay, so hopefully you will have all seen that courtship video. It's not very romantic in the world of hedgehogs in terms of courtship. So generally it's the males that chase the females. They will roam around looking for females or generally smelling for females because we think that they acknowledge each other through scent. When they find one, they will try to woo her by circling her, which hopefully you saw in the video. She's usually not very impressed and attempts to headbutt him out of the way. But after multiple attempts, often she will let him mate, which is quite a dangerous job if you're a male hedgehog with a very prickly female. So he's got to take it easy. Often there's a lot of noise. The police have been called on multiple accounts for people thinking that someone's being attacked, and it's turned out just to be some amorous hedgehogs. So you will be surprised at how loud they can be. Often it's the females that make a lot of noise, and they think this is because this attracts other males. So a kind of fitness contest, so the females can choose the most fit male to mate with. Both the males and the females are highly promiscuous, so they will both have multiple partners, and actually sometimes the female's litter will have mixed paternity, and it's thought that this kind of increases the genetic diversity and fitness in the populations. But basically the male will go on his way once they've mated, and they may never see each other again. He doesn't take any part in the rearing of the young, and they don't pair bond or stay together or anything like that. Okay. Okay, so the result of all that courtship and mating is hoglets, as I mentioned. So they're usually born in litters of about 4 or 5. So When they're first born, it actually looks like they don't have any spikes. They do, they're just underneath a kind of sack of skin, which enables the mum to give birth without an astronomical amount of pain, I imagine. So after a few hours, they start to get their baby spikes through, which look a bit like this on the left-hand side here. So they're quite soft, creamy spikes. There's not that many of them, but they do offer them some amount of protection. They're not really able to open their eyes and ears fully for a couple of weeks, and they're not able to fully curl up into a ball until about 11 days. So they are very vulnerable with these early stages when they're in the nest with mum. And they can be picked off by all sorts of predators, including even things like corvids might attack the nest. You can actually see in the middle picture here that as the hedgehog's getting a bit older, some adult spikes or older spikes are coming through that are the more brown colour, the more ones that you might recognise. And you can see, hopefully, if you can see, there's like a circle. There's a circle of skin that's hanging over a very special muscle called the orbicularis muscle. And this muscle is what helps a hedgehog to curl up. So when a hedgehog feels threatened, it initially pulls its skin and its spines up over its head and its rump to protect its most vulnerable areas, and then it will curl up if it's touched. And this orbicularis muscle acts a bit like a drawstring bag, pulling it all together, allowing it to have this tight curl up. And as you can see in this young hedgehog in the middle, it's not really fully developed yet. So it's not really doing a proper role. That's not really fully protecting it at the moment. And it can't really do that until it's a little bit bigger. And you can see the skirt of skin even on the slightly older hedgehog on the top right picture there, a little juvenile hedgehog. You can still see it there. And actually the spines are a really cool design. In our hedgehogs, they're hollow, which means that hedgehog can float quite well, coincidentally. But they've got a basal bulb on the end of the spines, which attaches to an individual muscle per spine. And this stops the spine being driven back into the hedgehog on impact, and it attaches itself to a back sheet muscle. And these individual muscles allow the hedgehog to raise their spikes at ever such a slightly different angle to the one next to it. And this means that it's a really formidable defense because there's no gaps that a predator can take advantage of to get inside. Adult hedgehogs have anywhere up to 7,000 spines, and they're generally banded, as you can see from the picture on the right there, in a sort of cream and brown pattern. They're not just purely brown. Hedgehogs make three kinds of nests. So the one on the top left here is what we call a day nest, frequently made by male hedgehogs in the summer season when they're roaming looking for hedgehogs. Often it's just grass pulled over the top of them, and they'll have several of them in their home range. The bottom left is a hibernation nest, a hibernaculum as we call them. These are much more substantial to get them through the winter. So these will be made of usually leaves, something like cherry leaves, lime leaves, oak leaves, and that sort of medium size. They collect and layer. They make a huge pile of them, 30, 40 centimetres in size, and then they sort of jump into it and roll around in it and make it all snug in the middle. And these protect them from the elements during the winter and keep a relative humidity as well, because they don't want to lose too much water during that time and become dehydrated. Obviously they don't want the nest to get really wet or to get blown away, so they tend to make them underneath bushes or banks of bramble or under sheds, some sort of support that's going to protect it a little bit. I'm just going to show you a video of a mother hedgehog making a nursery nest, which is the third type of nest. Okay, so hopefully you could see she was going back and forth to the same place there collecting material. A bit more eclectic what she makes the nest out of. It can be grass, it can be leaves. It often contains some softer material to provide lining for the babies. So this might be things like moss. Sometimes you might see her, like in this video, doing it in the day. Basically, she's a bit disorganized. She hasn't really made the nest in time, and she really needs to make it before the babies come out. Usually hedgehogs are of course nocturnal, so they're awake at night, not in the day, so it is more unusual to see them in the day. If you do see them out in the day, people tend to worry, understandably, because they are nocturnal. It might be like that she's a mum making a nest, so do look out for if she's going back and forth to the same place collecting material. It might be that the mum is lactating, depending on the time of year. Sometimes the mums just like to take a break from the babies, just hang out outside for a little bit and go back in. But sometimes the hedgehog might be a bit poorly, so there's a few signs to look out for. Obviously, if it looks injured, you know, if there's blood or if it's been bitten or it's missing a limb or something, then it's probably not very well. But equally, there are some things like sunbathing, if it's walking in circles, if it's wobbly, if it's coughing. These can all be signs of illness in a hedgehog. Our hedgehogs do tend to have ticks and fleas, but not that many of them. If they're overloaded with them, it might be a sign that they've got an underlying condition. Also, hedgehogs tend to be quite round. If they look elongated or thin for any reason, it could be that they've got some kind of illness going on. If you are concerned, you can call the British Hedgehog Preservation Society on the number listed, and this they'll provide you with advice and guidance, and also some information on a local rescue centre if you happen to want to take it to one of them. Okay, home ranges. So I mentioned before that hedgehogs aren't territorial, which is quite unusual for a British mammal. However, they do tend to have a rough home range, and those of the males will often overlap with several females so that they can mate with them. Males generally tend to have a larger home range than the females, as you can imagine, because they're out looking for the ladies. They may even travel up to 3 kilometres a night looking for ladies and looking for food. The bottom right diagram here actually shows the movement of a male hedgehog in the summer in a less than 2-week period. Don't worry too much, but essentially it shows a 9-hole golf course on the right, and on the left it shows a residential area where there's lots of centres of activity where people have put food out. But he's got 3 nests that he's using within that area, within that time frame, and he's wandering far and wide looking for food and females. Generally, it's thought that for sustainable populations to exist, we need at least 31 hedgehogs in an urban area of about 90 hectares, which is quite a lot of space, but even more so in rural areas. So 120 hedgehogs in 380 hectares of space. So this is based on modelling experiments looking at habitat. Essentially, the rural habitat tends to be a bit more degraded for hedgehogs, so they'll need more space to find the resources that they need. But really, the message to take away from this isn't necessarily the figures, it's the fact that hedgehogs live at low densities and they need lots and lots of connected space because they roam quite wide. This is an infographic, if I can get it to play, that was posted by Richard Yarnell's team, who study hedgehogs. When the blobs are stagnant is because they're sleeping, so this is in the day where they're nesting, and then when they move, that's speeded up movements of them moving at night. But essentially this shows that in a rural environment, the hedgehogs try and stay close to the buildings, and then they move around using the hedgerows and forage along these, and they generally avoid the big open fields and travelling through that landscape, and we'll talk a bit more about that later. Okay, so unfortunately our hedgehogs are in decline. So in Britain they are suffering quite miserably. We have lost up to 50% of our hedgehogs in rural areas, which is not good, and we've lost up to 30% in our urban areas. So about a third really overall since the millennium. Before the millennium, we don't have very good data because people thought of them as common and didn't really record them. But since the millennium, we have really good data. The People's Trust for Endangered Species every few years releases the State of Britain's Hedgehogs report. So we've got one up and coming really, depending on what's happening with COVID. But those are the latest stats from 2018. The Mammal Society has recently written a whole review and population status of all our British mammals, and they have listed in terms of Britain hedgehogs as being in the vulnerable category, because they might well still have a big range that we saw on the map, but they're actually getting quite sparse within that range in terms of number. This all seems very depressing. The upshot of this is that in urban areas, in areas where hedgehogs are still present and haven't been lost, actually weekly counts are sometimes showing that they're increasing in number. So on the urban scene, there is some good news. Lots of people are attributing this to the fact that we've got lots of community engagement projects that are engaging urban communities and trying to get them to improve their gardens for hedgehogs. Of course, it's a correlation. We can't claim that that's the case. We can't claim that hedgehogs are increasing in urban areas because we've been engaging communities. However, it would be nice to think that that could be a contributing factor, and that the work that we've been doing is making a difference, and all those people out there who are signed up to helping hedgehogs are making a difference. The reasons for the decline are unfortunately quite complicated, and some of the reasons will be more of a factor in local areas than others. So there's not just one thing that we can target to try and help our hedgehogs. Some of the bigger factors include things such as habitat loss, so building over lots of stuff, but also removing hedgerows in the rural environment has removed pathways for our hedgehogs to travel. As we saw in that video, they tend to hug hedgerows as they walk in rural areas, and they see them as a safe place and they forage along them. So without them, the landscape actually becomes quite fragmented. And in urban areas, this often happens when we build lots of brick walls or gravel board fences, which is becoming more and more popular. And I talked before about how hedgehogs like to travel far and wide, and they need to in order to find food and mates. So physical barriers like that can become such a problem, as well as those of things like motorways and train lines. Roadkill in itself is a big problem. So this was underestimated in the past, but a recent study suggests that we lose up to 335,000 hedgehogs a year on our roads. And we have a population estimate of less than a million hedgehogs in Britain. So this is actually a huge amount of our hedgehogs are potentially getting killed on the roads. And the race is on to try and find ways that we can help hedgehogs cross our roads safely. There's potentially a lack of food issues, so there's been an increase in the use of pesticides, herbicides, lots of different chemicals on our land, which simply, if nothing else, removes the food that hedgehogs eat, because we know that they like to eat insects. Also, of course, there are the potential issues of poisoning up the food chain. And in terms of lack of food, they do have competition for food from badgers in particular. Badger will eat 5 times the amount of food or worms as a hedgehog. So if there's lots of badgers in an area and not much food, then they could potentially outcompete hedgehogs. They do also sometimes eat hedgehogs. There is direct predation going on there. Unfortunately, hedgehogs and badgers have become a bit contentious as a subject, and badgers have been kind of scapegoated for the decline of hedgehog numbers, mostly because people have seen that badgers have doubled in number roughly since the 1980s in Britain, and hedgehogs have obviously halved since the millennium in at least rural areas. But this isn't a direct causation. So badgers aren't particularly prevalent in East Anglia, for example, and we're still seeing the same level of decline in hedgehogs in East Anglia as we are elsewhere in the country. So badgers can't be the whole story, although they may be a contributing factor in localised hotspots. In particular, it's thought that hedgehogs might change the behaviour of hedgehogs. So if there's a high density of badgers, they actually represent what we call a landscape of fear for hedgehogs, so that they might behave differently. So for instance, I showed you the video of where they're not actually crossing big arable fields, and they're sticking to near buildings and hedgerows, and that could be in response to high badger numbers because they're more open and exposed to predation when they go out into those fields. Something else to consider is injuries and disease. So lots of hedgehogs are brought into rescue centres with injuries usually to do with man, for instance, having got caught in strimmers or mowers or netting or pipes or drains. Also, they're brought in with a range of diseases, so they're susceptible to fungal diseases like ringworm or other parasites. They can get lungworm. That's what causes them to potentially have one of those hacking coughs. If you've ever heard that, sounds just like a human. But we don't actually know the impacts of those problems on their populations. We don't really know how many rescue centres there are in the UK for hedgehogs, let alone how many hedgehogs they're taking in and with what ailments. And we don't know how many are being released or how many recover. So that's one for future research. Climate change could potentially be an issue. So we know that although the warmth and increasing warmth over the winter might be beneficial for hedgehogs, it might actually be that they produce more litters and they produce more young that are able to get through, and they might not even hibernate in the winter if it gets that warm. They don't have to hibernate. It's a response to conditions. However, what we're currently seeing is fluctuating temperatures in the winter, which is a nightmare for any hibernating animal. So hedgehogs actually lay down a special fat for hibernation, which they metabolize to get them out of hibernation. So it's a brown fat. They lay it around their shoulders and around their heart, and they start to metabolize it. Often it can take up to 5 hours to fully come out of hibernation, and they've used an extensive amount of energy and fat supply to do that. So if it warms up and they wake up, they use this fat up, and then actually there's not that much food about because it suddenly goes cold again, and then they have to go back to sleep again. They've wasted that energy. And if that continually happens throughout the winter, it's going to be a problem, and they're going to run out of fat reserves. So that could be a problem. One last thing is the issue of rodenticides. So this is something that particularly worries me because it's not very well publicized and not much is happening to try and curb it. But rodenticides, I don't know how much you know about how they work. Essentially, they rely on a rat visiting a baited station multiple times, not just once. So the rat will travel quite a distance potentially in between those visits and die potentially quite far away from the baiting station in the open. Hedgehog will potentially eat a dead rat or bits of it, but not only that, it will also eat any maggots that are feasting on the dead rat. So it can get a kind of double dose of this rodenticide. And rodenticides generally don't break down in the animal when it dies, so they will be ingesting that when they eat the rat. So this is something that has started to worry hedgehog people across the world really. A recent study showed that 2/3 of a sample of 120 hedgehogs that were sent for autopsy actually contained rodenticides within their remains. And often it's the males that are found to have the higher levels, presumably because they're roaming further and wider looking for the females. So this is a real concern, not just because it might cause direct mortality, but also because it's thought that there might be implications on fertility of hedgehogs that have been ingesting these rodenticides. So that's all really bleak, but don't worry, there's loads of things that we can do to help, and there's loads of good news. So there are lots of citizen science and community engagement projects. I ran one at Warwickshire Wildlife Trust for about 4 years. So we started off with a Help for Hedgehogs campaign in 2013 that raised awareness about hedgehog decline. And then we moved on to a hedgehog improvement area project across Solihull and then Rugby, which really focused on empowering communities really to help save their local hedgehogs. And we worked hard to improve habitat on a landscape scale for our hedgehogs. There's lots of other projects happening across the country. Nationally, we have Hedgehog Street. So I'd really recommend that you check out Hedgehog Street. You can actually sign up to become a hedgehog champion. There are now over 85,000 of them across the country. You basically get given lots of resources and information, and the idea is that you go out and about raising awareness and spreading the word about hedgehog decline and things that people can do to help. The British Hedgehog Preservation Society I mentioned earlier about in terms of if you were worried about a hedgehog's welfare, they offer lots of advice and guidance and information. And there's lots of campaigning being done, particularly by Hugh Warwick. If any of you have read any of his books, he's a brilliant writer, very entertaining, and he campaigns frequently for different things to do with hedgehogs. Our Hedgehog Improvement Area project was very successful in terms of documenting the hedgehogs that we had in the county. So we actually only had 750 records in a total of Warwickshire for the whole time before the project started, which is so little really for an animal that's thought to be so common. So there was a big drive to get people to report their hedgehog sightings. And you can see from the number of blue and purple blobs on the map, or tetrans, 2 by 2 kilometre squares, that we massively increased the amount of sightings, which gave us a lot of information as to potential hotspots, but also potentially indicated some black spots where we didn't have hedgehogs, so that we could investigate the habitat and things that we might be able to do in those areas. The project has now finished. However, you can still submit your sightings to the Warwickshire Biological Record Centre if you do see a hedgehog dead or alive. You can also report them to the big hedgehog map, which is part of Hedgehog Street that I mentioned in the last slide. And the Mammal Tracker app, I believe, from the Mammal Society will also take hedgehog records as well. So sightings is one way we can find out where our hedgehogs are. But really, to be a bit more robust, we need to do some surveying for them. So footprint tunnels are an excellent way to survey for hedgehogs. They tell us whether a hedgehog is present or absent. So the scientific method says to put out your footprint tunnel for 5 consecutive nights with a certain number in a certain space, and then you can be fairly confident whether you have or haven't got hedgehogs. So essentially, it is a tunnel. So I do have a miniature version here. The hedgehog would not be able to fit into this, but just for demonstration purposes, what we've got is a tunnel that a hedgehog can enter at either end, and then we've got a plate. So you can put some hedgehog food or something smelly in the middle here that's going to attract the hedgehog with its excellent sense of smell, and then you paste an ink on the side here. So we use a fine charcoal that's mixed with a vegetable oil, about 1-to-1 ratio. You can use non-toxic powder paint if you can't get hold of that. Paste that on the side so it's nice and wet, and you've got some paper here. So you then leave the tunnel out on an edge, because we know, like with the hedges, that hedgehogs like to snuffle around the edges and move around the edges. So maybe by a fence, maybe by a hedge, and then you can go and check it the next morning to see what you found. And that's the most fun part, trying to decipher what footprints you found. So I'll just show you this video here of a hedgehog using a tunnel. So this was a rescue hedgehog, hence it was out in the day, but it did give a nice demo of a hedgehog checking out our tunnels. Hedgehogs are very curious. They do tend to enter these things. They're not that shy. They don't tend to shy away from them. So hedgehogs and their footprints. These are some hedgehog footprints that I found earlier. They look very much like a child's hand, but a bit smaller. So they do have 5 digits, although the 5th one can be quite hard to see. It doesn't always come out. But basically, they've got a hand that's very much like ours. They even have a thumb. So I'm not sure if you can see, there's a bit of a thumb there, and there's a bit of a thumb at the bottom right over there. They do have slight differences between their front and back feet. Their back feet are generally narrower and point outwards. But really, they just look like hands. They don't really look like any other footprint. They've got a very broad print, and they have what we call a plantigrade stance. And this means that they will put their whole foot, they will bear all their weight on their whole foot when they walk along a surface, which is great for us because it gives a really clear footprint rather than them just walking on their toes like other animals. So we're going to do a bit of a footprint quiz now. I will set up a few polls. I have put each of the prints in the middle, and then I've put a sort of zoomed in section of them on the right hand side, because I know sometimes the polls can actually obscure the picture on your screen if you're using a tablet or a smartphone. So first one, number 1, if you could just respond with which animal you think made this footprint. Hopefully you can see at least some of the footprint. Okay, got about 64% have voted so far. Okay, I'll just give you a few more seconds for anyone else who hasn't. Okay, I shall end the poll there. So I'm pleased to say that you're all very clever, and most of you chose the correct option, which was a cat. So some of you may well have pet cats. I guess the identifying feature here is this wibbly wobbly line at the bottom of the print, if you can see that, which actually the middle bit of the wibbly wobbly line goes downwards. There's also quite a lot of hair marks, which is quite characteristic of cats, of their fur. So brilliant on that one. You can see the results there. Weasels can look quite similar to cat prints. Badgers, I can see the logic there, but hopefully we'll get a chance to see some of those as well. Okay, so moving on to the next one. I'll launch the poll on this one. So if you can all vote on this one. Okay, I'll just give you a couple more seconds for those of you that haven't voted. Okay, so we'll leave it there. So you are mostly all right again. So it is some form of small rodent. Lots of little dots basically in arches. It does look quite similar to a rat. So that is quite a good guess for those of you others. I'm not surprised no one chose beaver. You probably guessed that these are footprints that we found here in Warwickshire anyway, and we don't have any beavers. A beaver would be a very different print. Okay, so we'll move on to the next one. So if you can vote on what you think this one is. Okay, great. I'll probably end it there unless anyone wants to make a last minute vote. Okay, so most of you were correct in this one. It is in fact hedgehog. So it's a bit difficult to see in that the hedgehog prints are sort of overlapping each other. This is quite characteristic of hedgehogs. They'll trample over what they've already walked over. Sometimes you even get a nice bum swipe where they've put their bum in their ink and they've swiped it all over the paper. They're quite messy, but hopefully you can see that they're quite sort of chunky looking little hands. Okay, next one. I should probably have said, actually, this is all anonymous. No one can see what you're voting. Okay, almost there. Just a few more votes from people. Okay, most people have voted. I'll probably end it there. Okay, so we've got a bit of a tie going on between weasel and squirrel. So I can tell you that it is in fact a squirrel. It actually looks quite rodent-like. Probably the most recognizable feature is just how long those feet are, if you can imagine a squirrel. Quite a hard one, that one. So we'll go to the next one. This one's quite different to the others in its looks. Almost done. Most people have voted, it looks like. Anyone else? Okay, going to end polling there. So vast majority of you got this correct. It is a bird. So it's kind of got the 3 lines for the toes. There is actually a 4th line coming downwards from the base of those, but usually that doesn't come out, and all you get is a bit of a dot at the end of it as a sign of a bird. Just a few more. So I will launch the poll for this one. Again, a little bit different looking. Okay, most of you voted. I'll close that one there. And quite logical results there. Most of you were correct with toad. So it does look very starfish-like. If you can imagine the feet of a toad, then hopefully you can see how that might work. That central one is actually 2 feet together there. Next one. I think most of you have voted now. I'll end the poll there. Okay, you were mostly correct. Again, you guys are on it. So this one is a newt. One of the most distinguishing features of the newt is the little round blobs that are on the very end of its toes, if you can see that. So you can see some examples. You can see some here. round little blobs on the end of its toes. Quite a cute one to find. You don't often see that one, to be honest, in your tunnels. Okay, the penultimate main one. Most of you have voted. Okay, I'm going to end the poll there. So Ashley was quite close on this one. The answer is rat. So it's basically a bigger version of the small rodents that we saw earlier. These are sometimes confused as hedgehog prints, but actually you can see they're not as broad. They're mostly just little dots, and they're fairly symmetrical arches. At least you can see it on this one in the middle here. So a bit of a tricky one, that one. And this is our last main one. Okay. Okay, I think most of you have voted now. I'm going to close the poll. And you were mostly correct. So this is a badger. So it's hard to tell size-wise when it's on the computer and blown up, but this is a much bigger print than all of the others. This one's actually from a juvenile badger. It's a fairly small print for a badger print, and it's not really showing its claws. And there are some other features that if you enter your footprints, you can see that make it more juvenile. But we often don't get adult footprints in the tunnels because the adult badgers are simply too big to fit through. Okay, so well done. I mean, mostly correct, really. You know your footprints. So I'm just going to do one more N1 that's a bit harder. So you probably have to tilt your head to the left for this one because we're going right to left most of the time on the direction that the animals are traveling in. And we'll do one more poll. So there's 3 different animals in this one. So this might take you a little bit longer. Bit harder, this one. Okay, most of you voted. I'm going to end the poll in a few seconds. I'm pleased to say that you were mostly correct again, and this one's quite hard. So we've got a hedgehog at the top here, which you can sort of just about make out. Obviously, this is a very well-used tunnel, so there's lots of trampling over the different prints. This one's a rat, again quite large, lots of dots, fairly symmetrical. And this one is actually a wood mouse. You can tell the smaller rodents by doing some little measurements if you want. So very well done. You've all done really well on those. I don't know if anyone did get a chance to set their own tunnel. I'll have a look at the Padlet that I set up for those of you that are already signed up to the programme. See if we can open this up. So I don't think anyone's uploaded anything. If you do get a chance, I did send out the method in my email. You've only got a couple of weeks really to set one up before they go into hibernation if you do still want to. But of course you can always do it next year when they're coming out of hibernation too. And you can message me with any more information that you'd like about how to set up a tunnel. They're a really good method of seeing if hedgehogs are around. But also they are now one of the tools that's being used by ecological consultancies. If this is something that you're looking to go into, it's one of the main methods that you can use to see if hedgehogs are around before a development is built on. There's also some mystery prints here that I'm going to leave up on the Padlet for you to have a little guess about and see if you can figure out the 3 different animals that are present on this one. So do check out the Padlet and make a few comments and upload any results that you get yourselves. But for now, back to the screen. So footprint tunnels can tell us whether hedgehogs are present or absent, but they can't tell us numbers. And sometimes we really need to know this for population estimates. So there are some other methods. Most of them involve in some shape or form trapping hedgehogs in order to mark them and then release them and then recapture them and do some fancy maths to find out how many hedgehogs you've got around. Generally at the Trust, we don't tend to trap hedgehogs. You can trap all sorts of other animals. There are lots of legal obligations, and really the welfare of the animal needs to be considered and how necessary it is for you to do that. So we don't tend to do that. You can do lots of other things that are less intrusive, for instance, like radio tracking and GPS marking. All of them are quite laborious, and hedgehogs like to hide under hedges, which makes GPS tracking quite hard. There is a new method that is being trialled, the REM method, using camera traps, which are a great way to see if hedgehogs are around. And it's hoped that this will give us an ideal measurement of density. But this is still under trial at the moment. The main method that we have of telling abundance at the moment is through torchlight surveys. And this is something that we regularly do. So we have done for the last couple of years. And if you want to get involved in this as a volunteer, you can. It's in the process of kind of being half run by the Wildlife Trust and half run by the Mammal Group. The idea is that the Warwickshire Mammal Group will take this over in years to come. But obviously with COVID, this has been quite difficult and we haven't been able to run all of our surveys. So if you are interested, it's definitely worth letting me know, and I can always put you on the list because I am the one that runs them. You do need a license from Natural England to be able to mark your hedgehogs when you torchlight survey. I am the license holder here in Warwickshire, so I generally run them. So I'm going to show you a video now. I'm hoping that you will mostly be able to see it. Like I say, don't worry too much if you can't. I can always send it. You will send you a link. And this is showing some of our recent torchlight surveying that we've been doing here in Warwickshire. So here we are at Coombe Country Park. It's September, so we're back doing our hedgehog torchlight surveys. So this means that we go around with a bright torch, having a look in the undergrowth where hedgehogs are likely to be snuffling around, foraging for their invertebrate food. So we're having a good night so far. We've found a sub-adult female, which means that the hedgehogs have been breeding this year, which is fantastic. And it's good to know because we couldn't come here in May, because we couldn't run the surveys because of COVID-19. So as you can see now, we've got some extra precautions. So we're all wearing masks for the benefit of us and the hedgehogs, because hedgehogs are mammals. So although we think the risk is low, they could contract COVID and vice versa. We're also staying 2 meters apart and we're disinfecting all our equipment pretty much constantly to make sure that we're not going to spread any COVID germs. But we're looking forward to seeing what we find. At the moment, we're just walking along this hedgehog highway, as I would call it. It's a bush, as you can see, that runs all along this length, and we often find hedgehogs snuffling along the bottom. I haven't seen any yet, but you never know what we're going to find, and that's one of the joys of hedgehog surveying. So we've spotted an adult hedgehog from afar. Oh, nice weighty one, this one. Wow. This is a proper round hedgehog, the kind of size you want to see. Looking nice and healthy. Just going to try and uncurl you a little bit more. Oh, another lady. Not particularly prominent nipples on this one. It's gone a bit darker. So I don't think she's pregnant or lactating. I think she's just a good size. They're not particularly bare around the outside, so she's probably bred this year, but a little while ago. Checking her eyes. And her ears are looking healthy. No ticks or anything, really good condition. So just to give it away. But I reckon it's going to be a good weight. Oh, yes. 936. Brilliant. Really good weight for this time of year. So we put on 5 numbered tags, just because they shed them, just like we shed our hair. So it gives us the best chance of re-finding them and knowing who it is. Alright then. I think we've got all the information we need about you. So we've got a hedgehog that we have tagged before that is new for this evening. So we'll have a little look. Alright, this is number 7. Oh, this is the one we always see. Can't see any obvious ticks or anything. Your nose looks good. Your eye looks good that side. Yeah, she's looking proper healthy. Put 2 more tags on now because she's got 3. So we just need to replace them. To be released. sub-adult, unmarked, thin spines. $4.99, yes, another sub-adult. $40. Not that far away in weight from the other one we found. Who knows, could be the same litter. So I hope you all enjoyed seeing that video of our recent surveys that we were able to take due to this recent funding. So it's really great to be able to show you. Obviously you can't all be out in the field at the moment, and it does take away some of the antisocial nature of these surveys. You didn't have to stay up all night and walk around many kilometres. That's one of the major disadvantages of Torchlight surveys. As you can imagine, it can be quite hard to see hedgehogs if they're in longer vegetation, so you tend to only see them in the shorter vegetation. And they do tend to live at quite low densities, so you don't tend to come across that many hedgehogs of an evening. On that evening, we came across 4 hedgehogs in Coombe Country Park, and they were all looking in very healthy, good condition, which was nice to see. So here we are. These Torchlight surveys can tell us quite a lot about our hedgehogs if we repeat them. So we do our hedgehog surveys every May and September when our hedgehogs are most active, as I talked about earlier, the reasons why. So we can make lots of maps. Personally, I'm quite into QGIS if anyone likes their maps. But we can do things like look at heat maps to see habitat preferences. We can calculate their home or at least their foraging range at that time. So the map on the left is a bit of a demonstration of that, which with the different colours representing different hedgehogs. So one of the main things to point out about this map is hopefully you can see the fuchsia kind of bright pink ones that we have here. So we've got an actual tiny range in the spring for this one hedgehog, and this was when she was pregnant, so she wasn't really moving very far, and she was about to have her young. But then in the autumn, the bigger square represents her home range, or at least her foraging area of those evenings. You can see it's much larger. She was wanting to eat. She needed to build up her fat reserves ready for the winter after she'd had her young. So you can see differences like this, and you can see their habitat preferences. One of the main areas we focus on in Coombe is this kind of long stretch here, which is actually around the driveway. And they tend to really like this area around the car parks. It doesn't seem that salubrious to us. We have the same thing happening in Regent's Park in London. And at least for Coombe, we reckon it's because we've got these very old veteran trees lining the driveway that are actually packed full of lots of invertebrates. And snuffling around the base of these provides them with lots of food. And it's surveys like this that enable us to advise these parks and places on how to manage their habitat for hedgehogs. So at Coombe, at least, they've started changing their cutting regime so that they actually have some longer grass around those trees for a longer period of time for the hedgehogs to use, rather than it all being cut at the same time and removing some of the habitat. We also sometimes come across injured hedgehogs. So there's a picture down the bottom here of Basil, who was found, well, we actually smelt him before we saw him. He was quite infected by the time we saw him, and he had a horrible strimmer injury. And again, we advise the park on this, and they now have certain precautions in place for when they strim the land. But we took Basil in. He was sent to a rescue centre who looked after him. We re-released him back where he was found, and actually saw him the season afterwards. and he was absolutely massive going into the winter at 1,200 grams, going really strong. So that was really nice to see. So they can tell us loads, the Torchlight surveys, if they're done over time, and they are the main way to tell at the moment for the abundance of hedgehogs. So again, if you were to work for an ecological consultancy, if you were to survey for hedgehogs, you might be required to do Torchlight surveys. In terms of moving on to habitat, because we're now nearing the end of the webinar, these are some things that you might want to think about in terms of encouraging people to do in their gardens, or you yourself if you happen to be lucky enough to have a green space. So you need to think like a hedgehog. So hedgehogs need somewhere to shelter, they need somewhere to find food, water and mates, and they need a connected space. So we talked about how far they need to roam, so they need to be able to access all of these different areas. So some tips for people in their gardens mostly. One of the key things is to create hedgehog holes in fences. So this has been really successful in terms of campaigning. Just cutting a 13 by 13 centimetre hole in the fence. If everyone did that along the street, we'd have a whole hedgehog highway, as we call them, for hedgehogs to roam across. It can be difficult in solid concrete, so sometimes it's good to make the hole in the wood and then put a little ramp up to it. But some makeshift methods, and you can see some of the hedgehog highway signs that you can get from the PTES. I also mentioned at a different time. Mown lawns actually can be quite good for hedgehogs because they provide nice, easy access to worms. However, it can be good to make them a bit more diverse than your standard garden lawn, so you can sort of sow other species in there, like bird's foot trefoil, clover, things like that. You can also leave some areas to grow longer. These can provide nesting habitat in the day for particularly male hedgehogs, and also they provide more sort of invertebrate foods, different types, especially if they're sown with wildflowers. Again, these need to be checked for hedgehogs before they're cut, because this is a favourite place for hedgehogs to rest in the summer, just when you're going to cut them. Shrubs and climbers are great, particularly really dense bushes that hedgehogs might want to nest underneath for hibernation. They're a really good thing to have in your garden. Also ponds provide some water, but you do need to provide a ramp because hedgehogs are well known for not being able to get out of ponds once they've fallen in. Compost is good for hedgehogs because it provides them with food, but it also is a place for them to hibernate in, so do be careful if you turn compost. Hedges, I have talked about hedges quite a bit, and they are fantastic. They provide not only food and shelter underneath for a hedgehog to make its nest in, but also they connect the landscape for hedgehogs to use as sort of corridors throughout the landscape. If you can plant one in your garden, that's absolutely brilliant. Try and use native species that encourage native insects that they're going to eat. Prickly ones even deter burglars, so can be quite useful in that sense. And dead hedges as well, which are made of dead material that we might talk about at another time. Try and avoid using pesticides if you can. Use more natural methods. So things like copper tape and wool pellets can deter slugs from going over certain barriers. Obviously, slug pellets, not great. We try and discourage the use of those. And you can use ferric phosphate, sort of iron-based ones instead, that don't harm hedgehogs. Metaldehyde pellets are actually going to be banned for outdoor use from spring 2022, a recent successful campaign put forward, so that's really good news. And definitely avoid rodenticides, as I mentioned earlier. Log piles are great because they also provide somewhere for a hedgehog to nest, and not only that, but they can provide some invertebrate food. Be careful at this time of year if you're lighting a bonfire. It's a perfect place for a hedgehog to nest amongst, so do make sure that you either move the bonfire before you light it, or even better, just light it. Just make it just before you light it, so there's no chance for anything else, not just hedgehogs, to have gone inside. You can buy or make hedgehog houses, and these provide a good place for a hedgehog to nest, particularly if there's no other habitat available. So try and use or make one with a tunnel and also a baffle inside. So this just means a dividing line on the inside to separate the nesting chamber from the entrance. And this can deter certain predators from getting in. And then, of course, you can provide some bedding material. Sometimes hedgehogs will just rip it out and go and collect their own, but sometimes they might use it. We talked about the leaves that they like earlier. If you don't have any leaves in the green space, use some pet hay. They can easily use this. In urban areas, we do try and do a lot of work, as I've mentioned, about landscape scale conservation. So we will generally tend to improve hedges, so we might plant them or maintain them. And we also try and make those areas a bit more diverse. So we've been working with local authorities, particularly in Rugby, have been really responsive in trialling some changes to their urban green spaces. So having some wildflower meadow areas and some woodland to mix them up a bit to provide a bit of a mix of habitats. We've done a lot of work in the planning system, particularly in urban areas where new housing developments are going to occur. I've mentioned the hedgehog holes, and this is the main thing that we push to connect the landscape of new builds. Lots of other things as well, obviously trying to encourage them to be generally a bit more green, things like hedgerows and using native species, not exotic species, and things like log piles. Been really successful in this. In Warwickshire in particular, we've sort of led the way, as it were. I've written some planning guidance for national use with the PTES and BHPS that you can download for free, and I can send out as well. And the planning guidance has now changed to incorporate hedgehog holes, which is brilliant. In terms of the rural landscape, so again, I don't want to say hedges too often, but we want to try and improve hedges. So they need to be managed appropriately. So you can cut one side of each hedge sort of every year, so it's not all cut at the same time, but that keeps it nice and bushy and available for hedgehogs to use. If you can incorporate that with a strip of land by the hedge, a field margin, that's even better. Again, somewhere for hedgehogs to nest in the day and somewhere for them to forage. Having some areas of scrub and deadwood and leaf litter, places that they can eat. And again, not using too many chemicals is brilliant. Something to note is trying to reduce tillage or reduce ploughing. This actually can compact the soil, which means it's quite hard for earthworms to survive. So that if you reduce this, you get more earthworms and more diversity and less erosion as well of the land. All cattle grids that are installed now should have ramps in them, because hedgehogs often fall into cattle grids and then can't get out. But some of the older ones may need to be retrofitted. So if you see any cattle grids without any ramps, shove in some sort of brick or something down the side to make sure that animals can escape. There's quite a bit of debate about when to cut certain landscapes for hedgehogs. Obviously, you've got to balance this with all of the other wildlife and all of the other things that you're doing on your land. So you just need to make sure that you're not doing what we call the annual death cut. So grass tends to be cut in July as a general rule, which is exactly when hedgehogs will be resting in it. So if you can try and graze the land instead, or potentially do a high cut, check for hedgehogs, and then do a lower cut, that's even better. And of course, if you could try and cut in the winter, they're not going to be using that grass. They're actually going to be amongst the bushes anyway. If you are interested in hedges and you want to survey for hedges, you can learn how to do so and actually take part in a survey for citizen science, which is something you can get involved in lockdown, doing by yourself out and about. That's run by the People's Trust for Endangered Species, and the website is at the bottom there, and again I can send that out. But that's a really good way of checking the state of a hedge, and then there might be able to be some work done to improve that hedge and improve the landscape. One of the main things to note is that whatever changes you make to the habitat, you try and do it on rotation, and you leave what we call a habitat matrix. So I've talked about diversifying the landscape. What we try and do is have a mix. So hedgehogs might use woodland edge, for instance, to nest in, but they might look for worms on the short mown grass. They might rest up in the day in some field margins. So if you can have a real range, that's best. And actually, an Irish study showed that hedgehogs tend to move habitat throughout the year depending on the availability of food. So they'll use different areas at different times in certain locations. So the main message is have a mix, and your hedgehogs will be happier, and make sure that that mix is nice and connected. So I've overrun by a few minutes, not too bad, hopefully. The main resources for this are on our webpage for hedgehogs at the top there. Again, I can send out some more information to those of you that are registered as volunteers. But really, we have a whole range of resources on there, and it also mentions the resources that I've told you about. Again, if you want to check out the project webpage and the hashtags, they're at the bottom there. But what we'll do now is we'll move into a question and answer session. So if you want to leave, that's fine. That's the end of the webinar. That's not a problem. But if you would like to stay and listen to the question and answer session, please do. What I'll suggest is I'll stop sharing my screen, and then if you can digitally raise a hand if you know how to do this, then I can try and go through sort of one by one questions rather than everyone talking at once. If you don't know how to raise your hands, please use the chat function, and I'll try and get to your question that way. Okay, so enough of me talking. If you want to answer any questions, feel free. Ask any questions, sorry. I'll try and answer them. So I can see one raised hand. So Becca, I don't know if you want to unmute yourself and ask your question.
Hi.
Hi.
Hi, I was just wondering, are hedgehogs a protected species? And if they're not a protected species, do you think they will gain that status because of being vulnerable? Or
yeah, excellent question. So the law of hedgehogs is a little bit complicated. So they are protected under certain laws in Britain. So for instance, they're protected as a mammal, so you're not supposed to kill them and intentionally harm them. In terms of the Wildlife and Countryside Act, which is really one of the main acts that we use in conservation, if you were to be an ecologist consultancy, this is what you would mostly use. They're listed as what we call a Schedule 6 species instead of a Schedule 5 species. So this affords them some protection in the law, but not as much as what we generally tend to refer to as the protected species, the Schedule 5 species. So these are things like great crested newts, badgers, hazel dormice, for example, all of which you'll need a license to do work with. So hedgehogs are Schedule 6, and there have been a couple of petitions over recent years to put them as a Schedule 5 species, because this would afford them protection, and it would mean that if somebody wants to develop a space, they're pretty much forced to do surveys and to mitigate for hedgehogs where they're found. So logically, that would seemingly make sense. The government has so far rejected these petitions. Oddly enough, the last one was rejected for a strange reason, I thought. There were lots of reasons they could have given, but they chose the reason that Schedule 5 is reserved for species that are intentionally harmed by humans and sort of persecuted, which I'm not sure is true of a lot of the Schedule 5 species. I'm not sure people necessarily go out to kill a bunch of hazel dormice, for instance. So I think that's dubious reasoning, in my opinion. However, I do have reservations about them becoming a Schedule 5 species in the sense that they are a real generalist species. So we've talked about them using a lot of habitats and the fact that they have such a wide range because of that. And they eat such a diverse range of foods, so they can be anywhere almost. So realistically, almost any development would need to survey for hedgehogs. So this would put a lot of pressure on developers in the planning system. So there would need to be some kind of processes in place to stop this halting the whole system really, and really putting pressure on it, and sort of almost giving ecologists a bad name. Like you see all these newspaper headings like, you know, development cost 5 million because they built a nuke bridge, or, you know, whatever, things like this. So there would need to be procedures in place if that happened, I think. That's not to say it wouldn't work, and it would certainly offer hedgehogs more protection than they have. And as time goes on, now that the Mammal Society has recently listed them as vulnerable, and of course all of the changes that are now happening with Brexit, the laws may well change and different animals may be included. Sorry, that was a really long answer to your question, but hopefully it answered it.
yeah, thank you very much. Thank you.
Okay. Any other questions? I can't see any raised hands, but you can just raise your hand, you know, normally if you want. I'll see it if your video's on. Oh, yeah, okay, Sally, go ahead.
I was wondering if there's any way to stop your cats from getting in the hedgehog tunnels.
That is a great question. Hedgehog tunnels, not so much. Cats love pretty much the food that hedgehogs love that we bait the tunnels with, and often they're baited with cat food. So we get a lot of cats in our tunnels. In fact, I surveyed a golf course once, and literally as soon as I'd laid each tunnel, a cat would go through it. It was just like Catville, which can be frustrating. One of the things you can do is set your tunnel as late as possible into the night, so that there's less of a chance of other animals using it. Of course, cats do tend to be quite active at night, so they might well use it. You can try and use tunnels within the tunnel, so you can use sort of like a pipe, which you can get curved pipes in particular. Cats generally don't like to go round corners when they don't know what's on the other side. They're quite reticent about that. So if you can create a corner going into your tunnel or your hedgehog house, or your feeding station, whatever it may be, that can often deter cats. So sometimes we suggest putting something like a couple of bricks on top of each other, a short space away from the entrance to whatever it is that you're trying to stop the cats going into, because this will force the animal to go round in a corner in order to get inside. And often, not all, and some cats are very curious, but often this can deter cats.
Okay, thank you.
Anyone else? I would definitely encourage you, if you can, to set a footprint tunnel at some point in your life. They can be quite cheap to make. There's lots of DIY kits, and I'm going to send you some resources for those of you that are signed up to the project, so that you can have a look at how to use them a bit more. You can even make footprint tunnels out of things like, well, footprint traps out of things like sand, wet mud, and you can use food colouring even instead of things like ink and charcoal if you can't get hold of that. So you can really do makeshift ones, but it's a good way to try and see. And sometimes I've done work with universities and colleges before. If you don't have any green space of your own, you can often just ask them if you can put them in a corner somewhere that's out of the way on campus or wherever. But it's definitely a good way. And if you're not sure about footprints, there are lots of guides out there, but you can also send me over what you find, and I can help you identify what you found, no problem. Like I say, that's one of the main methods that an ecologist would use, and also torchlight surveying for abundance. So hopefully you've got a kind of flavour for what that involves. I can't see any more questions, but if any more questions do come to you. Oh, okay, Eleanor, go for it.
Over the summer, I noticed, I don't know if it was the same one, but I noticed a hedgehog in the garden quite a lot. So we bought a hedgehog house, but obviously you were saying that they like roam quite far. What do you think is the chance that it could actually be like nesting in our garden versus just like traveling around it?
It's a really good question. So part of it would narrow it down. If it had been a female, it might have been more likely to be in your garden. It's quite hard to say, really. Often hedgehog houses aren't used. People spend quite a lot of money on really nice hedgehog houses, and a hedgehog will just nest in a pile of leaves a couple of feet away. So it could still be in your garden even if it's not using the house. But really, I'm afraid I can't give a definitive answer to that. You know, it's nice that you provided some habitat. A hedgehog housing census was actually conducted last year. However crazy that sounds. But what it found was that hedgehog houses are more likely to be used if, oddly, they're within 5 meters of a house or dwelling, but not too close that it's too loud. So somewhere a bit out of the way. Generally, I would advise putting them on the side somewhere like a bush or by a fence, because that's where hedgehogs tend to snuffle. And if you can provide bedding, that's even better. So yeah, like leave the leaves out, or some hay bedding if there's nothing else. Those will increase your chances. And again, if it doesn't have a tunnel on it, you can just make a tunnel. You can put like a pipe or something to try and dissuade other predators from getting to it. and those are some features that will make it more likely that it will use the house. In the summer, you can see if it's got residents, not by opening up all the time because that will disturb it, but you can kind of lodge a twig or something in the entrance, and then you'll know if that gets dislodged that something's coming out at night. Or of course, if you have access to a trail cam, that's even better. That's brilliant. But yeah, that'll increase your chances of it being used. But I don't know. You may well have a resident. You may not even know that there's a resident because they're stuck in a pile of leaves somewhere and not using your hedgehog house.
Okay, thank you.
Provided the habitat.